Good morning, good afternoon to our listeners, and welcome to another session of Tales from the Field here with Solar Geek. I'm Mo Horowitz. I'm our Chief Commercial Officer, and I'm happy to be hosting this webinar today. Today's topic is trends in loss analysis, and I'm going to be joined by my colleague here, Aaron Wilson. If you recall from the previous session, we were discussing a lot of trends around building projects in more challenging locations. And I think of Spider-Man's quote, right? With more power comes more responsibility. And as solar PV takes on a bigger and bigger chunk and a bigger and bigger responsibility inside of our grid, we see more and more importance of proper loss analysis, O&M, transparency, really to be able to manage these assets like the true assets that they are. And today we'll talk about that industry. Aaron, welcome on board. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, Aaron, before we jump in and get to the actual projects at hand, give me a little bit of your background today and sort of where does this concept of O&M and loss analysis find you?
I lead our product management here at Solar Geek. So I really approach this from a software engineering perspective. And a lot of what I spend my time on is talking to our customers, prospective customers, and really everyone who's involved in a PV project, whether that's
Mhm.
EPCs, O&M, developers, other software providers, with the goal of really understanding where folks have needs that aren't being met by the tools that are currently available to them in the market.
So let's start 30,000 feet. Why is this suddenly so critical, right? I mentioned this concept of greater control, more challenging projects, but why is loss analysis and O&M becoming such a critical component of the industry today?
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously no secret that the PV market is becoming super competitive for everyone involved. Developers are working on these really scarce lands with tight margins. They need to maximize their return. The EPCs and O&M from their side, they have these tight contractual requirements that are, measured down to a couple of megawatt hours. And at the same time, you have these sites which are getting more and more complex that have more and more hardware in the mix. And the result then is that everyone is really eager to try to identify and attribute these losses, whether they're trying to resolve the issues and actually recover those losses, or if they're trying to prove that an issue was attributable to something outside of their control. And what I'm hearing in a lot of my conversations is that if a few years ago you could get by just addressing the kind of big glaring issues, that's not the case today. In today's tighter market, everyone needs this much higher level of granularity to try to recover losses that maybe a couple of years ago you would have written off.
I've heard the metaphor of, right, the PV industry was sort of that teenager of yours who wants all the benefits but is just not willing to behave like an adult quite yet, right? And I think maybe this is part of those growing pains of needing to be as dispatchable and transparent as the other sources of energy. But you mentioned loss analysis, O&M. These aren't new. There are providers out there that are providing, well, today various softwares that do solve or address some of these. So what is current state? What are people doing in their day-to-day? Maybe more importantly, what are they not doing? What's not being addressed? What's missing? Like, what's the gap that you're seeing in the industry now that is getting everybody to sort of focus on it again and talk about it?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and a lot of time talking to people most recently at Intersolar. And there definitely are a couple of really good monitoring platforms that are dedicated to loss
Mhm.
analysis. But the thing is that the leading SCADAs do this today in a pretty rudimentary way. They're still trying to catch the really big stuff, but not looking
Mhm.
at the smaller things. What I think of as like these slow leaks, the things that fall through the cracks. So the big SCADAs, the ones that most sites are using, so they'll give you the PR in terms of your contract, and they'll have really broad loss categories, things like,
Mhm.
general inverter losses. But the O&M teams generally still have to do a lot of manual work. If as they're opening tickets and seeing issues in their day to day, they can, tag those issues and attribute them to a specific loss category. But that's really manual, and sort of by definition it only includes the issues that the O&M team is actually identifying and handling. So out of the gate you're missing a lot of these things that are not going to fall into things that the O&M team are seeing actively. And a lot of these smaller losses that do add up are essentially just going unaddressed right now. Obviously, trackers are near and dear to my heart. tracker losses for trackers that are not perfectly optimized, they really can add up. And from what I've seen, virtually none of the leading SCADA tools are integrating this into their reporting and loss analysis in a kind of a detailed and actionable way.
I want to dig in the point you just made about manual because that makes me think of what is the pain point? What are you hearing from customers, not just in terms of the missing outcomes, but their day-to-days? How are they describing that pain in terms of whether it's X amount of hours I'm doing this manually, that I can't get a report out on time? What are the pain points that you're hearing in these conversations?
So it makes me your question makes me think of a conversation that I had with an O&M manager from a pretty large scale German O&M and full stack kind of PV company that I spoke with at Intersolar. They do an O&M for something like 3 gigawatts, and on a monthly basis, what they're doing is that they have a team of data analysts who sit down. They go one by one, pull data from each of the SCADAs that are under their portfolio, which might be different SCADA providers.
Mhm.
And they'll go in and manipulate the data for each contract to match the specific PR formula used for that contract. They'll then give that back to those data analysts will go and then give that file back to the O&M manager, who will take it, send it as a Word document or whatever to their O&M team in the field. And he's describing this to me as like a totally reasonable thing to do. That they'll send it to the O&M team in the field. The O&M team will then go through and try to manually attribute the losses that they see there. And so they'll go and look back through their tickets. They'll try to identify, okay, the inverter was down for this many hours on these two dates. That should add up to this much. Okay, we can probably tie between those two, that piece of data and that, what we saw in the field. And then the O&M manager will turn that into, a report that they're building for their monthly performance call.
I'm literally hearing the AOL dial up in my head as you're describing this. I'm thinking like, didn't we finish this, what, 15, 20 odd years ago, right? Like, I'm almost waiting for you to tell me that they have to take a floppy disk and insert it and wait for that in terms of like the manual process that we're describing here.
It's not far from that because the next thing that he does is that he writes some comments for himself on the side, and I'm not sure whether those are like comments in the document or like physically writing them with a pen on the,
Wow.
in the margins. Because the O&M manager, some things are going to make it into the report that he's going to review with the developer on the call, but some things are he wants to save them on the side in case they come up in the conversation. Then he'll reference them. So it really is as old school as you're describing.
The cynical part of me also says that's great, job security for the people who need to do that, but I can't imagine that's good data hygiene or levels of accuracy for the people who actually count on those numbers.
Yeah.
Maybe there's
Well,
even like
and
an internal conflict of interest there.
yeah, and the kind of scale that O&M teams are managing today, the number of sites that they're managing, the growth of PV should keep them in good jobs.
So Aaron, congrats. I'm giving you your dream. I'm giving you a magic wand. And you can take that magic wand and you can wave it over the industry and you can magically take 50,000 engineers and they're yours. What do you do? How do you see this being solved? Take away all the constraints. What's the new way forward? What's the best way to address or try to solve this issue?
The dream is you pull all the data into one place, and that's everything, right? Like
Uh-huh.
inverters, the power meters, the radiance sensors, trackers, wind sensors, cameras that are running machine vision, data from the grid. You take all of that, bring it together, and then you want to have automatic continuous analysis of the actual data that you're seeing there versus the expected data. So you need to have a good
Mhm.
physical model of what you're expecting to see from all of those components,
I'm
and
cutting
then
you off.
analyzing it.
Like I was just going to say, I've heard anecdotally from some of our early customers, and maybe jumping ahead, but just that start point of what is should be expected was a revelation, right? Like obviously you're about to describe sort of how to take that further, but just sort of a unified, this is what you should be expecting now off of all these real world criteria was like a wow. To us, sometimes it seems like an obvious, but I just wanted to touch on that because like you're about to take that 7 steps forward, but even just that first piece of this is the current state expected generation, not just off of a theoretical model built in PV system right 2 years ago, but now, right? So sorry to continue, but I thought that was worth
Yeah. And it's interesting in terms of like some of the leading skaters, and I ask myself why they don't do that. And I think because it does get into things that are a lot more algorithmic, which For
Right.
us, that's super interesting. I think for some of the leading SCADAs, it's territory that they try not to get into as much because they're trying to stick to just the pure facts, the data that's coming out of the systems, and you're not necessarily getting into building a physical model based on that. But in any event, you're taking all of that data, you have the expected versus the actual, and then you need to go way back down into the details and analyze at the level of current and voltage that's coming out of the inverters, and that's when you start pulling out these real concrete insights. So when you have all of that, you can start doing things like saying, instead of, performance seems off this month, and, it could be this, it could be that, you start getting this monthly view where you have exact loss quantities in a waterfall. So we think of this as a loss analysis waterfall, which you can picture as, on one side, you have your 100%. What should you expect to be producing given the real conditions, right? Like you said, not some
Yeah.
theoretical, at one time we calculated this 3 years ago, but like today, what should you expect to be producing? Or not even today, right? Like minute by minute, what should you expect to be producing? That's on one side, that's your 100%. On the other side, you have your actual. What did you actually produce? So let's say that's 75% of what you would have expected. Everything in between is explaining that remaining 25%, which is your losses. And you're really breaking that down piece by piece. You're ranking it by impact. And maybe most importantly, you're tying it to root causes. And it starts to get really interesting when you think about whether it's recoverable or not, right? So some of these things, there's not much you can do about them, but there's a bunch where they can be categorized as recoverable losses. And the dream then is that you tie that into recommended actions. So you could be recovering this. Here's what you need to do in order to recover this. And that really comes down to your bottom line, which I think the key is that this can be, if we can do this visually in a way that's intuitive, highly tailored to
Yeah.
the site and to the workflow. I think the dream is also that this isn't just another O&M tool. From what I've heard from a lot of developers and people in more managerial roles in EPCs and even in O&M organizations, there's a feeling that a lot of the O&M tools are built for the people that are way deep in the weeds, super technical. That there's kind of this gap for developers, right? As a developer, I also want to understand where the losses are, and I want to have this as sort of a shared source of truth between everyone who's involved in the project, where we can, I as a developer can look at this and say, okay, let's look at this, let's understand what's going on here and what we're doing to fix this. So I think we're not far off from that, and I think that's a super exciting vision.
I like that. The shared source of truth. But let's be a little bit practical, right? Like I gave you that magical wand. Now I'm taking it back for a second, and I'm going to ask you to give me maybe a more practical version of, so how is Solar Geek actually approaching this, right? Like, what are you working on a day-to-day basis? How are we trying to come as close as we can to what you just described as, right, like the great solution? Like, what are we doing practically and pragmatically to move in that direction?
Yeah. So good news is that we've actually already moved in that direction. We have the first version of our loss analysis product already out, which is great because we're starting to see feedback from customers and understand how it's helping them and where we can go next. I'm really lucky because at Solar Geek we're a hardware company in our bones. We have hundreds of sites that have trackers on the ground with full suite of sensors and local monitoring. We have connectivity to inverters, so we have all of that real deep kind of integration in the hardware on the ground at the site. But we
Hmm.
also have a really strong software backbone, and loss analysis is kind of like the dream. It's the place where the two of them come together, where we take all the data that's coming from our hardware really low down at the site and bringing it together with our very high level, powerful kind of algorithmic side.
Right.
So like I said, we released this first version of our loss analysis product. And what we're finding is that there really is something to this idea of the slow leaks. And if there's something that I would want everyone to think about, to come away with from this session, it's not to underestimate these slow leaks. What we're seeing is that these things, they actually do add up. If you look at an example like shading growth year over
Yeah.
year, or soiling, or slight deviations in tracker elevations, what we see in our usage data is that they really do add up. Even though they're, from the O&M team's perspective, they're never going to make it to the top of the list. Like I was saying before, O&M teams are spread super thin. They're managing, in some cases, hundreds of sites. So there's always going to be fires that are bigger to put out than these slow leaks. And if you don't have a good way to see them, they're just, the O&M team is rarely just sitting around thinking, okay, what else could we what else could we do? They're constantly, have inverter issues and big things that are, grabbing most of their attention.
I think there's two interesting things with that. One is, I think that the term that comes to my mind is, right, death by a thousand paper cuts, right? Meaning each one on its own is not that much. But when you have that accumulation, right, eventually, or the straw that broke the camel's back, in a sense, like any of those metaphors, right, of like something small, but the accumulation thereof can be dramatic. And two, when you just talked about prioritization, and I think if you're a busy O&M team, for example, you might think something is more glaring, but if that's not taking into account a more sophisticated approach of, for example, time of day pricing and right energy morning or afternoon or whatnot, right, to take that into that calculation of should I not prioritize something, that's, I think, another reason this overall is becoming more critical, because the concentration of where the profitability in a project can often lie in like very specific points. If you're in a merchant market and you're not generating max during middle of the day, no one cares. In fact, you might be better off if it's negative pricing, right? And then you're not
Right.
losing anything. So it's almost like there's more stress on those specific points of profitability. So now we looked at sort of the Solar Geek approach. I'm giving you back actually, this time it's not your magic wand, it's your crystal ball, right? And I'm going to say, okay, so where do you think the industry is heading with this? Like overall, where do you see us in maybe 2 to 3 years? Where do you see us in, 5+ years? Like, what's the roadmap that you see into the future here?
So first of all, I think we get an award for going this long in the conversation without mentioning AI. But I need to break it. I need to break
Yeah.
the streak now because I think that AI actually has a big role to play here in terms of proactively serving up insights.
Mhm.
Until now, we've been speaking about this as monthly reporting. So you'd go at the end of the month and you're building your report for the developer,
Yep.
and you want to be able to explain and attribute all the losses. Why would you want to wait until the end of the month? And I think about this as if I had an AI agent who kind of acted like the most senior member of my O&M team,
Mm.
and let's say that they were the most senior member of my O&M team, and they actually had time on their hands, right? They weren't putting out fires, but
Yeah.
they actually had time to be insightful. So the AI agent would use this powerful loss analysis model that we've been talking about to identify the losses in real time, make sense of kind of the massive amount of data, and then serve up the insights proactively. I think the proactivity is a huge component here. So the way that we see this in our roadmap, and I'm not talking about the far future, we're starting to build kind of the next versions of this, is that it becomes increasingly autonomous. So first it's serving up the insights in real time. Then the next phase is that it's suggesting resolutions, which are actually good resolutions, like,
Mm.
things that are actually insightful. And then you can take it to, third level autonomy where you have, autonomous action or man in the loop autonomous action. The sky's the limit.
Wow. Interesting. I mean, maybe just to make it as practical as possible, can you give me a specific example of what this might look like in the field, right? A specific use case? What's the alert? What's the analysis? What's the action? Just sort of walk me through like a potential use case for that level of autonomy, if you may.
Yeah. Um, I mean, soiling is, I think, always an easy example to think about. It's very concrete.
Mm.
So, let's say a site has a cleaning schedule, but then something changes. I don't know. There's dry conditions, or it's especially windy, or you have dust coming in, and that's classically something that the SCADA is not going to alert you about. But let's say you have this AI who is constantly monitoring your site, and it'll notice this. It's going to be looking at slight variations in the current and voltage compared to past months or time of day and previous days. It's going to be looking at weather, real time and forecast weather data. It's going to be looking at camera footage and using machine learning to analyze what it's seeing in the camera footage, comparing it to camera footage from the past. And it won't just provide you that data, but it'll actually give you a proactive, actionable insight. So you can imagine like a really nicely timed message falls into your inbox as the O&M manager. It says from your AI agent, it's saying, here's what I found, here's the impact on production, here's what I think you should do to actually address this. And then you could go and chat with your AI agent as kind of a thought partner to dig deeper. And again, I think what I'm describing is like not at all science fiction. I think this is near term stuff, which is really exciting.
So it sounds like I'm combining this with what you said before. The first part is getting all of this data into a data lake so you can actually access it. And then today, in a sense, we're still not fully autonomous or automated in terms of how we're pulling or analyzing the data. But in a sense, what you just described is, I think, the most obvious use case for AI, where quick, high and analysis of big amounts of data, that's what AI can do really well. And maybe we do, hopefully soon, see situations where the AI is managing again, as you said, with man in the middle, eventually maybe more autonomously. I think of it a little bit as sort of the autonomous driving aspect, right? Meaning maybe there's some parallel there in terms of how that's developing and what we'll be willing to do with solar assets. Interesting. Well, Aaron Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today. That was fascinating. Our viewers at home, if you want to learn a little bit more about Solar Geek, check us out at solargeek.com or on our LinkedIn page. We put out a lot of content around our developments, projects, technology, and we look forward to seeing you again in one of our future webinars. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Mo.